So as Marie said, I'm presenting this on behalf of Emma Diviney, who's one of our lived experience advisors. Emma put a huge amount of work into this project and put a huge amount of herself as well into this project, and really commend her for the work that she has done in this space. So I will be reading some of her notes, and some of it will be mine, and hopefully it will be coherent and in some reasonable time frame, but we'll see. Okay, is that better? Okay. So Emma has put in her notes, and I know that she did talk to her family member as to whether it was okay to say this, that she has supported someone who has been secluded and chemically and physically restrained within the mental health system. And so she approached this project with that lens and with that experience. And I think that's really important that she did. So these are findings from the consultation that Tandem undertook to gather feedback from families, carers and supporters to inform the drafting of the strategy towards eliminating seclusion and restraint, which the department obviously have undertaken in respect of the relevant recommendation, the number of which has just left my head, but obviously fits into the whole reform process. So Emma wanted to thank the families and carers and supporters who were interviewed for this project. She said that people were incredibly candid with their responses and articulated the issues and solutions so powerfully. She also wanted to thank Kate Lessing, who was a co-author and Tandem member, the advisory committee, which was Amanda Pocket, Paula McCluskey, and Stella Prideaux. And she also added her wonderful colleagues at Tandem, who helped her to navigate through the process. So rather than say family, carer, and supporter all the way through, we will just use the term family. People will know that we mean family in the broadest possible sense when we talk about that. Some of the content obviously is challenging today. It's a challenging subject, and for a lot of people, it can potentially bring back those traumas that people have experienced in that space, and we're very aware of that. If you do feel that you need support either in the room or online, please utilize the 1-800 number that's on our website, or if you're in the room, please talk to one of the Tandem staff if you need to. So there were several methodologies used to gather feedback. There was a scan of the submissions to the Royal Commission, and they started by using keywords to identify themes on the impacts of seclusion and restraint, the settings, cultures, situations, and practices that lead to restrictive practices, and the areas that families feel they could, if enabled and supported appropriately, contribute to preventing restraint. Changes that need to occur in health and other settings to eliminate the practice of seclusion and restraint as well. On the point of language, part of the process in scanning was made difficult by the fact that families, carers and families tend not to use sanitized clinical language. They tend to talk about actually what happened in a very real way. So that makes doing any sort of scan very difficult, because there's a whole heap of different words that people use to describe their experiences depending on what it was. And just by example, just like to cite one example from somebody who described chemical restraint as their family member being in a coma-like state, described physical restraint as their family member being bashed, and described seclusion as imprisoned by himself in isolation, which is, to be honest, the reality for a lot of people. And sometimes I think the sanitized clinical language that is used actually tends to normalize it in some way and make us think that it's reasonable, when, in my opinion, most of the time it isn't actually. So there were a number of consultation groups that were undertaken, and the different themes were tested from the submission. There were 27 participants, and probably online you can see those different backgrounds that people came from. So we were talking about people from CALD communities, the LGBTIQA+ communities, older people, younger people, people who identified as neurodivergent, and people who identified as having a disability. And also what I thought was really clever actually in terms of how they conducted this, they ran a scenario setting to actually talk about what it could be like, rather than just, there was a lot of conversation I know about people's experience and people's traumas in that space, but also it was kind of part of the aim of the project was to look at what it could be like, how things could be different, and what role families and carers and supporters could have in creating that different way of doing things. There wasn't any formal gathering of diagnosis on the people that people were supporting, and people described their experiences. Certainly there was a high percentage of people who described the experience of supporting somebody who has both a mental health challenge and an alcohol and drug challenge, and those things running concurrently was common. So 70% agreed or somewhat agreed that restraint and seclusion should be eliminated. 85% of people said there was an over-reliance on the practice completely. Some people felt that 10 years was too long, which is what is set out in the Royal Commission, the 10-year programme to eliminate it. Some people felt that that was far too long a time frame. Other people felt that actually you needed a long time because the support services needed to be in place to prevent these situations arising. There was also a group of people who described seclusion and restraint as something that saves lives, and they felt that in their crisis situation, actually it was something which had to be done as they saw it in offering relief in high periods of distress. A few people raised concerns about the health worker safety if those practices were removed too quickly. There was, however, almost full agreement among participants that restrictive practices are traumatic, dehumanizing, and disempowering, and only one person didn't agree. And whilst I might not agree with that one person either, I actually think that it's great that we had somebody who was prepared to say, I don't agree with the 26 other people. And I think that's really positive. And again, it's credit to the people who were running the project that they created that space where it was okay to say something quite different. As the quotes on the slide suggest, trauma was an enduring theme throughout it. For the participants, the person they support, their other children, hospital staff, and others accessing services, they describe complex, intergenerational, and compound trauma. Experiences of seclusion and restraint also create a pervasive distrust in the system. And this deep distrust also meant that some families didn't trust that the significant changes required to eliminate seclusion and restraint could be achieved safely in the current system. Most participants see mental health services as places where human rights can be and are violated, where people can be stripped of their dignity, and where harm can happen in the name of healing. The distrust is a barrier to care. It stops families from calling for help, often putting the person they support and themselves at risk. When they call for help, some people talk about feeling guilty about exposing their family member to the potential of being restrained. So restrictive practices were also seen as a byproduct of a broken, overstretched mental health system, which the Royal Commission, of course, did describe. The distrust and trauma described suggested that this reform agenda won't be easy due to the deep scars many people have from past experiences. Skilled facilitators, trainers, and managers will be required to build collective trust to navigate the reforms in this area. And I think that was one of the key things that came out of this project, was about the need to build trust with families, carers, and supporters. The need to actually take some time and do that, to actually put energy into connecting well with people, to build that level of trust, and actually to say what you're going to do and then do it is just so important. So what in terms of looking at how to do things differently, the focus groups talked about a whole ream of areas, to be honest. They felt that the project itself was a little bit too narrow, and that we needed to look much broader at the much wider system in terms of eliminating seclusion and restraint, that it doesn't just all happen at that very pointy end of the services. that we need to be looking right across in terms of early childhood, schools, that there's no healing without housing, in the sense that you can't be discharged to the streets and expected to get better, or your family continue to sort of support somebody because there's no actual housing that works for them. They talked about the need for a long-term, sustainable, accessible support in the community. They want medical and therapeutic models of care alongside services that can address the underlying social and economic issues that contribute to distress and impede healing. Because more support in the community means fewer people in crisis, our hospital system, and fewer opportunities for incidents where seclusion and restraint are deemed required. So essentially, the earlier we get involved, the less likely there is to need that crisis kind of response. The families don't want to wait until the person they support is considered a risk. And again, I know this is a common theme, in the sense that people try and get help. They're told the person isn't unwell enough, or things aren't difficult enough. And then things obviously become too difficult, and then it turns into that emergency response. And we actually don't have a lot going on in the middle. And that's the problem. Or, well, no, that's not the problem. That's one of a few problems, actually. The majority agreed that police intervention was often brutal and often resulted in seclusion and restraint as a first response and not a last resort. They want emergency response teams to be peer-led, multidisciplinary, and trained in de-escalation. They don't want, and this is words from the focus group, paratrooper-type responses, flashing lights and police cars. They talked about the stigma and shame they felt when their neighbours saw their family member treated like a criminal. They want the use of divvy vans banned. 3 family members talked about their 14-year-old child being transported to hospital this way, and divvy vans were certainly described as a form of seclusion. They want ambulance trips to be more comfortable and less stimulating. They want a fleet of mental health ambulances that look like civilian cars and include options for seated travel with their chosen support person. They want them to be equipped with sensory modulation tools, soft lighting, noise-cancelling headphones, and weighted blankets. And I don't know if anybody here has ever been in an extended ride in an ambulance, but it really is not a fun space to be in. Most participants described being stuck in a revolving door of admission to emergency departments and short hospital stays, and a constant repetition of service, access, discharge, re-access, which leads to that frustration, escalation, and the possibility of restraint. Highly stimulating emergency departments, long waiting times, being guarded by uniformed guards and police are considered factors that precipitate an escalation. They stress that the interpersonal communication skills of the triage team can set the tone for how a person copes, and the ticker box questioning process can be overwhelming and confusing. A participant who cares for someone who experiences delusional thoughts said that providing personal details at a busy front desk behind a perspex screen only increased their symptoms. Said staff don't often check if there's an advanced statement that may provide guidance to support the person at times of distress. They want a concierge service in EDs and similar, where information about the person's trauma responses, sensory needs, and preferences can be collected by the call center, by ambulance staff, and provided in advance to a peer-led concierge team. The team can prepare for the person's arrival in a quiet, private space with its own entrance. Those people would be trained in de-escalation, they're trauma-informed, and greet the distressed person and their supporters in a warm, welcoming way. They acknowledge everyone's anxiety and confirm their commitment to support and ask about everyone's needs. There is little waiting time, and once the person feels safe and calm, the triage process could then commence. In the unit, the lack of comfortable, visually appealing indoor and outdoor spaces is identified as a factor as well, leading to the use of seclusion restraint. So participants want to see art-filled spaces, relaxing visuals, music, plants, sensory needs considered, and outdoor exercise spaces easily accessible. And I think that's one of the things, actually, going back to the Connect centres, that the Northeast Centre, and I'm sure others as well, but I've only been to the Northeast one, have done incredibly well, created a really relaxing space. The colours they've used, the art they've used is trauma-informed, and they've created a space that actually is very easy to go and relax in. Plus, they have the advantage of having fantastic views out their windows, which adds to the sense of tranquility there, right in the middle of the city. So the slide there, the previous slide, shows there, the problems that people are experiencing, and essentially what people want to see is the opposite of that. So where there is no autonomy or choice, they want choice. They want a sense of autonomy. Where things are imposed by fear or coercion, they want conversation, understanding, sort of person-led responses rather than responses that are right across the board. This is what we do when people do this to us kind of responses. They want responses that actually talk about people and understanding those people. And they don't want an overly biomedical response. They want a response that understands psychological distress and responds in a psychological manner, not just, you're upset, you need a tablet or you need an injection or those sorts of processes. They want something that's very different. According to participants with some diagnosis such as BPD and some people with dual diagnosis and those with neurodiversity, those situations are often poorly understood, can very much impact how a person is treated, and the history as well is described as something that because it happened, somebody was restrained last time, they're going to need restraining this time, and rather than actually looking at the circumstance, participants talked about clinicians describing people as untreatable or their symptoms as attention-seeking, disobedient, self-inflicted, and therefore needing seclusion and restraint. Participants call for a service model that addresses the person's psychological distress rather than diagnostically led and prioritized individualized care. A supporter of someone diagnosed with schizophrenia commented that there were a complete lack of long-term treatment beds and then that support in the community. So families want to be valued by the system. There was lots of discussion about medical services not seeming to value the contribution that families made to the person they were supporting. And of course, the Royal Commission very clearly identified that families not only make a difference to the person they support, but the fact that they support someone actually makes the system function even to the not acknowledged inadequate level that it does function. So if families and carers stopped caring, which they're not going to, but if they did, then the gaps would be so obvious. And yeah, it's I think it's hard to overstress that actually. So yeah, the support that families provided to navigate, to assist in navigating the system, the housing, companionship, material support, they were often expected to play a role keeping the person safe when they left hospital. And I remember from the focus groups we did for the family centres, somebody who responded very clearly that, around first responders and supporting them, they've responded very clearly with an expletive that we are the first responders. And certainly that is often the case. So families report some difficulties accessing and meeting with the clinical teams, describe being shut out and again not listening, and much the same as Wendy pointed out earlier, the themes that continue to come through the support and referral line. They talk about that sense of being judged and being seen as at fault in many cases. They all agreed that family members could play a role in helping to reduce the level of trauma and fear that the person they support is experiencing. They all agreed that they wanted to and could provide knowledge to help manage and avoid escalations, but most said they were seldom asked. Many participants expressed disappointment and distress that their understanding of the person they support was not utilized and situations escalate. So there was some advice that they came up with for services in terms of de-escalating. So family members also say they want their own needs recognised. The next one, or the previous one? Previous one, yep. So they want their own needs recognised, and again, those are some of the areas for that. One person talked about spending weeks sleeping on their teenager's bedroom floor and being too scared to leave the house for fear of something happening in their absence. They had no support from services and they felt incredibly alone. They knew their hypervigilance wasn't good for them and also wasn't good for their daughter. They described being invisible in the system until a bed was required and the hospital staff needed a discharge address when people are then contacted and informed. And, you know, very conscious that we're 2.5 years into a reform agenda, and actually, on the whole, I think there are pockets of some really good practice that we heard about in the showcase that was run last week, or the week before last, I think now. And there is some great practice out there, but there's pockets of it, and it's not widespread yet, and it needs to be. And I think that came across very clearly in this work. So as I mentioned earlier, the Royal Commission made it very clear that families and carers not only support the person they support, they actually enable the system to continue to function. So family members want family inclusive practice, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anybody here. And our next slide. None of these things would be a surprise to people in terms of what families and carers want to see. I think the frustration for people, and I think the frustration for us as well in Tandem, is that we are still not seeing it in a widespread enough way. And it's really common sense, actually. So participants talked about, next slide, leadership and cultural change, and the importance of that. Calls for investment in the training of staff in things like communication skills, people's ability to really understand the levels of distress when somebody is coming into hospital, or even somebody who's meeting a person in the community. Participants recommended compulsory education to support changes in culture and practice, including working with families, carers and supporters, trauma-informed, recovery-orientated and people-centered approaches. Which again, none of this stuff actually sits outside of what the Royal Commission recommended. It's all there, to be honest, and to some extent we're repeating this stuff. And I guess we're going to keep repeating it until it happens. So they wanted accountable, transparent and evidence-based services. They wanted plain language. They want to know what their local service is functioning like, because as we know, or as probably most people know, there is vast differences in the seclusion and restraint statistics, both within Victoria, across Australia, and of course beyond. So I think, you know, at Tandem, we certainly believe that the future can be very different, and we'll continue to raise these important issues at every level until we can truly have in Victoria a relationally centred mental health and wellbeing system